Hey friends, tonight we'll be exploring something a bit darker, an age of plagues, punishments, and a food called pottage that you'll wish you never heard of. We're taking a slow dive into what daily life was really like during the Middle Ages. Forget the castles. Forget the romantic nights and grand feasts that Hollywood loves to sell you. The truth? You probably wouldn't last a single day. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see where in the world this sleepy little community gathers from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for a little ambient hum, and let's drift back together. Congratulations, you've just awakened in the year 1325. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the fleas. Your bed is a rotting pile of straw, crawling with bugs, and packed into a burlap sack that smells like a barn floor. Because, well, 3 months ago, it was a barn floor. No memory foam, no pillows, and certainly no Egyptian cotton sheets. Just a coarse wool blanket that hasn't seen soap since last winter, and now weighs about as much as a small cow from layers of grime. You blink and wince as a church bell tolls in the distance. It's your alarm clock, medieval edition, louder, harsher, and utterly unforgiving. You live in a small wooden hut, one room, no windows, and a charming open-concept layout where your entire family, livestock, and whatever insects have taken up residence all cohabitate. The smell is complex, a mix of stale ale, sweaty bodies, goats, and something you really hope isn't mold. But you know, deep down, it probably is. Scented candles don't exist, and even if they did, they'd just melt into your dirt floor. You stretch, immediately regret it. The air is freezing, and your joints creak like an old wooden door. You're 22 years old, which, in medieval terms, is basically middle-aged. Your spine pops. Your knees sound like rocks being shaken in a cloth bag. The floor is wet, from last night's rain dripping through your thatched roof. Or crusty, from whatever your neighbor's chicken did while you slept. Either way, your feet are part of the ecosystem now. And privacy? What's that? Your whole family, and maybe a cousin who overstayed their welcome, is waking up beside you. There are no bedrooms, no curtains, no me time, just community, constant, unavoidable community. Welcome to a medieval morning. You are never truly alone, because the rodents, the fleas, and the 8 other people in your hut are always nearby. Somehow, you've pulled yourself out of that medieval straw pile. Congratulations, but now, nature calls, and it's not calling gently, it's screaming. Time to say goodbye to modern luxuries. There's no toilet, no seat, no flush, no roll of toilet paper, not even a grumpy plunger watching from the corner. In the 14th century, relieving yourself is an experience, a messy one, a public one, and somehow still a group activity. If you're a peasant, your toilet is probably a wooden bucket behind the house, and it's already full, because Uncle Wolfstan had a rough night, thanks to those bad turnips. The smell? It's biblical. You hold your breath, finish your business, and then, the grand finale, toss it into the street. Yes, the street. You're supposed to shout something like, "Gardez l'eau," Old French for "watch out below." But honestly, no one reacts fast enough, because streets in medieval towns are open sewers, a free-flowing cocktail of human waste, animal droppings, and liquids of unknown origin you'd really rather not investigate. If your town is lucky enough to have public latrines, congratulations. You now get to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in an outhouse where privacy is a myth and airflow is a cruel joke. Try not to breathe too deeply. Toilet paper? Never heard of it. Most folks wipe with straw, moss, rags, or, if they're really treating themselves, a scrap of wool. Sometimes, nothing at all, which might explain why handshakes weren't all that popular yet. And if you're lucky enough to live in a castle, surely things are better, right? Well, sort of. You might have something called a garderobe, basically a hole in the wall that drops your waist straight into the moat. Great idea, until your enemies figure it out. Because yes, sometimes attackers climbed in through the waist chute. Talk about a surprise entrance. So whether you're a peasant or a noble, medieval bathroom time is more of a humiliation ritual. It's cold, it's public, it's risky, and it's never, ever clean. One slip on a wet stone path, and you're face first in humanity's leftovers. And we haven't even talked about brushing your teeth yet. But don't worry, that's coming up next. You survived the bathroom. That alone should earn you a reward. Maybe a warm breakfast? Something cozy? Sorry, this is medieval Europe. Comfort isn't part of the package. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is more of a survival task. No eggs Benedict, no coffee machine gurgling to life, no toast, and definitely no avocado. You squat near the hearth and stare into a wooden bowl of something that looks like it was scraped off someone's boot. Welcome to your daily dose of pottage, a thick, mushy stew made from whatever was lying around. Grains, root vegetables, maybe a bean or two if the stars aligned. It's been simmering in the same pot for days, sometimes weeks. New ingredients just get dumped on top of the old ones. Less of a recipe, more of an ongoing experiment in edible persistence. Alongside it, a chunk of bread so dense it could block arrows, made from coarse rye or barley, often mixed with sawdust, acorns, or whatever else was available. Wheat? That's fantasy food for rich folks. This loaf? It's not your friend. You don't slice it. You negotiate with it. And what about drinks? Forget orange juice or oat milk lattes. You're drinking beer. Yes, at 6 in the morning. Because the water, it's basically a microbial zoo. So, you start your day with a weak ale. Low alcohol, high survivability. Even children drink it. No one's thrilled about it, but at least it won't kill you immediately. Want some meat or cheese? Keep dreaming. That's for Sundays, saints' days, and only if your Lord is feeling generous. Most commoners see meat a few times a year, at best. Fresh fruit? Only if it's in season, and not already turned into wine. And spices? Unless you're royalty, forget it. A pinch of pepper can cost more than your monthly wages. Salt? Valuable enough to be locked away like treasure. So you chew your gravel-like bread, gulp your early morning beer, and try not to think about the rat that might have nibbled your stew during the night. Breakfast doesn't give you energy. It happens to you. And now that you're underfed and mildly traumatized, it's time to work, because your life literally depends on it. So, you've had your sad medieval breakfast. Now it's time to get dressed. Not that it'll help much. Your wardrobe consists of one outfit, just one. It's either a rough wool tunic or a linen shift, the same one you've worn for months, maybe years. Seasonal fashion doesn't exist. You wear it until it falls apart or gives you some sort of rash. Underwear? Optional. If you're lucky, you might have a linen layer beneath. If not, you're going full medieval commando, under scratchy, sweaty wool, lovingly stitched by someone who had, let's say, a creative idea of what a seam should look like. No washing machine, no soap, no laundromat on the corner. Your clothes are stiff, stained, and smell like a compost pile that spent the week in a pigsty. Even if you wanted to clean them, it's a whole ordeal. You'd need to fetch water from a river or heat it over a fire, scrub your tunic with ashes or lye, and dry it under the sun, which shows up about 3 days a year. Don't even get me started on shoes. If you own any, they're made of raw leather, stitched by hope, and offer about as much arch support as a pancake. Most peasants just go barefoot, through mud, through animal waste, and through what we now call medieval landmines, otherwise known as sharp rocks and disease puddles. All of this means one thing: your skin hates you. You itch constantly. Fleas, lice, and bed bugs live rent-free on your body, and they're not going anywhere. Everyone has them. Nobles, itchy monks, scratchy kids, walking insect sanctuaries. No one escapes. You'll find yourself absent-mindedly scratching your armpit with a wooden spoon while chatting with the village priest. No one reacts. Your skin is raw from constant rubbing. Your scalp? A battlefield of bites. And if you develop a rash, too bad. No doctor, no ointment, no one to gently whisper, "Hey, that might be scabies." You just carry on. And if you don't get an infection, lucky you. That rash will simply join you for the next 6 months, like a clingy medieval sidekick. So now that you're dressed in misery and wrapped in itchy layers of damp wool, it's time to step outside. Time to flash that cheerful morning smile. Except you don't. Because in the Middle Ages, smiling is risky business. Not emotionally, dentally. There's no toothbrush, no paste, no floss, no minty rinse to save the day. Dental hygiene is about as trendy as bathing, which is to say, not at all. Some people might chew on a stick, or rinse with wine or vinegar, but for the most part, your teeth are on their own, and they're struggling. By your mid-20s, your smile resembles something rescued from an ancient tomb. Cavities are rampant, gums inflamed, and those aren't food stains. That's rot. There's more decay in your mouth than in the local root cellar. Sugar isn't widespread yet, but it's starting to show up among the wealthy. Imported at ridiculous prices, sprinkled on small cakes, or used as edible status symbols. If you're a noble, congrats. You get to destroy your teeth faster than the poor. If you're a peasant, don't worry, you'll get there. Slowly, with gritty bread, acidic porridge, and years of chewing things that should not be chewed. Toothaches? Get used to them. They're like medieval rain, always lingering. That deep, throbbing pain that makes you consider praying, drinking, or pulling the tooth out yourself. And that wasn't sarcasm. That was the actual solution. There weren't dentists, but there were barber surgeons. Yes, the same person who trims your hair also pulls teeth with iron hooks by candlelight. No anesthesia, just pain, gritted teeth, and maybe a scream or two. If your tooth gets infected, enjoy the fever, because without antibiotics, a simple cavity can turn into sepsis. And yes, a toothache can kill you. Something that today sends you to a pharmacy, back then could send you straight to your grave. And socially, it's no better. Kissing? Good luck. Halitosis, chronic bad breath, is everywhere. If you're single, your dating profile doesn't include teeth. It includes your land, and maybe how many chickens you own. In short, your mouth is a battlefield, and it's losing. But hey, enough about oral horrors. Let's head outside, because your real job, the one that will bend your spine and bruise your hands, is about to begin. Time to go to work. No desk, no office, no coffee machine, and absolutely no promotions. If you're like 90% of the population, your job is simple. Stay alive while working for someone else's comfort. You're a peasant. Congrats. That means you work land that doesn't belong to you. It belongs to a noble who probably doesn't even know your name. You rise with the sun and stop when it vanishes behind the trees. Your tools? A wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and whatever parts of your body haven't given out yet. There's no weekend, no clock out time, just sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week. Sunday is off, unless you're harvesting, or fighting off raiders, or praying feverishly for your infected toe to stop turning black. The work is brutal. You plow fields by hand, or with oxen, if you're lucky enough to own one. You dig ditches, sow seeds, weed the crops, carry water, until your spine starts resembling the letter S. No one asks how you're feeling. No one cares. If you're a woman, surprise. You do all that. Plus raise the children, cook, clean, feed the animals, spin wool, and pretend your husband's lice aren't moving into your blanket. And the kids? They start helping by age 5. No toys, no school, just a tiny wooden rake, and the quiet dream of not dying from the next winter flu. If you're not farming, maybe you're a blacksmith, a tanner, or a cooper. Great. Now you work with fire, or animal guts, or corrosive chemicals all day, in a dark, unventilated shed. Your pay, survival, your perks, occasional bleeding, break a bone, too bad. Catch a fever, drink warm beer and push through. You can't stop. If you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, medieval Europe has a solution for that. It's called being replaced. So, you grip your shovel, ignore the blisters, and keep digging. Because in the Middle Ages, your job isn't a career. It's a slow-motion endurance test. And now that your back feels like it's been split in half, let's talk about the weather. Because in medieval times, the weather isn't a topic of small talk. It's a form of punishment from the sky. Let's start with winter. There's no insulation, no central heating, no double-pane windows, just wooden walls, with gaps so wide you could pass a chicken through. Your windows are covered with fabric, not glass. And the fire in your hearth? A nice idea. Except you don't have enough firewood to keep it going. Why? Because firewood is expensive, and gathering it from the forest, sometimes illegal. That's right. You could be executed for collecting the wrong stick in the wrong place. So, you wrap yourself in your one damp wool tunic, huddle by the dying embers, and still wake up with your nose frozen solid. Your feet are permanently cold, often wet. Your fingers, stiff little popsicles. Frostbite doesn't get diagnosed. It's just called bad luck. Fast forward to summer. Sounds better, right? Not even close. Your home now turns into a clay oven. No fan, no cross breeze, and absolutely no deodorant. You sweat through your clothes, but can't take them off, because showing too much skin is scandalous, and also leads to sunburns, bug bites, and judgmental glances from your neighbors. Flies swarm around your unwashed body, drawn by the smell of last week's goat stew still fermenting in the corner. Mosquitoes buzz by your ears while you try to sleep, if you can sleep, between the yelling next door and the crying babies. In the fields, the sun bakes you like bread. No sunscreen, no protective hat, unless you manage to twist some straw into a hat-shaped object like a desperate scarecrow. Worst part? You still have to work. Heat stroke? Just called a bad turn. So you're either shivering in your hut, wondering if your toes will make it to spring, or sweating through your only pair of socks while your thighs slowly chafe into oblivion. And the one thing that never, ever changes, your clothes still itch, your food still tastes like despair, and your next chore is already waiting. Welcome to climate control, medieval style. There isn't any. Feeling thirsty? Want to freshen up? Maybe splash a little water on your face to wake up from this damp fever dream of a life? Too bad. Because in the Middle Ages, water isn't your friend. It's quietly plotting your downfall. Let's start with drinking. That stream nearby might look fresh, bubbling, clear, like something out of a fantasy book. But it's not. Upstream, someone just emptied a chamber pot into it. Or worse, a pig carcass is slowly decomposing in the current. Every sip is packed with bacteria, parasites, and the full microbial population of 14th century Europe. That's why people drink beer. Yes, even kids. But before you imagine medieval toddlers doing keg stands, let's be clear. It's small beer, weak in alcohol, strong in survival. Brewing it meant boiling the water, which made it safer than whatever was trickling through the town ditch. If you were rich, you might sip wine instead. A great way to stay hydrated, and very unproductive before noon. What about bathing? Surely people used water for that, right? In theory, yes. In practice, not really. Back then, many believed that bathing opened your pores and let disease sneak in. That's right. Cleaning yourself was considered medically risky. So the dirt on your skin, that was protection. A crusty little armor against sickness. Communal bathhouses did exist, but they quickly gained reputations for gossip, mischief, and, let's call it, medieval extracurriculars. Naturally, the church got involved, and many were shut down. Even if you wanted to bathe at home, it was a full production. First, fetch the water from the well, then boil it over a fire, pour it into a leaky wooden tub, and then pray that no one else used it before you, or worse, after you. As for rainwater, it collects in open barrels, where birds poop, insects hatch, and moss thrives. Sounds refreshing, doesn't it? So whether it's going in your mouth, on your body, or onto your crops, water in the Middle Ages is less a life source and more of a daily gamble. One wrong sip, and you're spending your final days curled up in a straw bed, sweating, groaning, and rethinking every decision you've ever made. So the next time you drink tap water, raise a quiet toast to your ancestors. They didn't have hydration, without hazard. So, maybe you drank the water, or maybe you didn't. Maybe you just stubbed your toe on a rock shaped like disappointment. Either way, you're sick. You need help. You need a doctor. Too bad. Because you live in the Middle Ages, where medicine is basically polite torture, with a theology degree. Let's begin with the diagnosis. Whether you have a cough, a rash, a broken bone, or something far more ominous, the explanation is always the same. Your humors are unbalanced. According to medieval medicine, your body runs on 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If those aren't perfectly in sync, something bad happens. Think of it like internal soup gone sour. Got a fever? That's too much blood. Solution? Bloodletting. Let's drain your life force into a wooden bowl using a rusty knife or a hungry leech. And yes, the town barber might be the one doing it. Imagine getting a trim and a hemoglobin extraction in one visit. 2 for 1. Feeling down? Anxious? That must be an excess of black bile. The remedy? Laxatives? Or maybe a warm herbal purge? Or just prayer? While everyone quietly starts building your coffin. Break a bone? Deep wound? Oh boy. There's no anesthesia, unless you count passing out from the pain. Surgery tools haven't been washed since the Crusades. Instruments heated over fire, not for cleanliness, just for dramatic effect. Germs? Never heard of them. The belief is that sickness comes from bad air or divine punishment. Stomachache? Must be your sinful thoughts. Time to confess while vomiting. If your symptoms get worse, expect more leeches, crushed beetles, and maybe a priest at your bedside, just in case it's time for last rites. At this point, they're prepping for the ultimate cure, death. And if, by some miracle, you recover, everyone assumes it was divine mercy. The doctor takes full credit, and the leech gets promoted. So yes, in medieval times, medicine isn't about healing. It's about surviving the treatment. After a long day of fieldwork, fleas, and bloodletting, it's finally time for dinner. You limp back to your hut, stomach growling, craving the one remaining joy in life, a warm meal. Bad news, your meal is probably trying to kill you. Let's begin with the basics. Food preservation? Not really a thing. No fridge, no freezer, just salt, smoke, or the naive hope that the cold night air keeps things fresh. If you've managed to score some meat, it's likely been hanging for days, covered in flies, soaked in mysterious brine, and shared with at least one rat. Bread, the cornerstone of your medieval diet. Even that isn't safe. In bad harvests, peasants get creative. Bark, sawdust, clay, all mixed in to make it last longer. And if it's rye season, you get a little bonus, ergot, a fun fungus that causes convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. It's like eating toast laced with LSD and tetanus. Vegetables? Only if they're in season. And you know what's always in season? Turnips, boiled, mashed, floating in pottage, turnips in all forms, forever. And pottage, if you recall, is basically a bubbling stew of mystery, simmering for weeks, possibly since your great-grandfather's funeral. Fruit might appear in the fall, but it rots quickly. Sugar, rare, expensive, and hoarded by the rich to show off their blackened teeth. Dairy, a gamble. Fresh milk spoils fast. Butter and cheese do better, but they're still packed with bacteria. People eat them anyway, because otherwise it's back to chewing shoe leather. And seasoning? Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg, worth more than gold. For the average peasant, flavor comes from onions, a pinch of salt, if you're lucky, and pain. Most meals taste like wet burlap, sprinkled with disappointment. But food in the Middle Ages isn't just a health risk, it's political. Game animals, rabbits, deer, birds, don't belong to you. They belong to the local lord. Get caught snaring a rabbit in the woods? You could be fined, imprisoned, or hanged. That's right, your dinner could get you executed. So, as you sit by dim firelight, spooning gray stew into your mouth, just remember, every bite is a calculated risk, but you eat it anyway. Because in the Middle Ages, food doesn't nourish, it tests you. Evening falls. You've labored, suffered, and just barely survived that sketchy stew. You might think the day is done, but don't get too cozy, because God is watching. And so is the priest. And so is your neighbor Agnes, who will absolutely report you if you miss Mass. In medieval Europe, religion isn't a part of life. It is life. The church controls everything. Your calendar, your laws, your marriage, your education, if you can read, your birth, your death, and everything in between. Think of it as your spiritual landlord, and you're always behind on rent. Daily life is structured around bells. The church bell rings in the morning, noon, and evening, not to remind you of time, but to remind you prayer is non-negotiable. forget to bow. Sin, eat meat on a Friday. Sin, dream vaguely about your neighbor's wife. Double sin. And hell, very real, extremely detailed. Priests describe it with flair, rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, demons with pitchforks, and eternal wailing. If the plague doesn't scare you, eternal damnation will. You can't read the Bible yourself. It's written in Latin, a language reserved for monks, priests, and that one noble kid who's never touched a shovel. So, you rely on the church to interpret everything. If the priest says your crops failed because you didn't kneel hard enough, well, better get back on your knees. Tithes, mandatory. You give 1/10 of whatever you produce. Grow wheat, give wheat, raise chickens, hand over eggs, own nothing? Congratulations. You're spiritually bankrupt and financially doomed. Holy days, plenty of them, but they're not for celebration. They're for fasting, confessing, and remembering that joy is highly suspicious. Question the church? Dangerous territory. Heretics are burned, witches are drowned, blasphemers get whipped, skeptics get corrected, with force. So you go through the motions, you chant, you bow, you pray, and you hope that after this dirt-covered life, your soul gets a seat in paradise, assuming the priest approves. Because in the Middle Ages, God might be merciful, but the church, not so much. And if you thought being a medieval man was brutal, try doing all of that as a woman. Same filth, same famine, same fear, plus childbirth, subservience, and near total invisibility. Being a woman in the Middle Ages is like playing on hard mode with no health potions and no restart button. From the moment she's born, a girl's path is mostly set. Marry young, have children, serve your husband, die exhausted. Education? Unlikely. Unless you're noble and shipped off to a convent, your schooling ends around the time you learn to churn butter and patch holes in a tunic. Marriage happens early, really early. Being betrothed at 12 and pregnant by 14 isn't odd, it's expected. And love? Irrelevant. Marriages are about land, livestock, and family alliances. Your opinion is not required. Once married, you belong to your husband. Your job, bear children, feed everyone, manage the home, and don't complain. Because if you do, you might be labeled a nag, or worse, a witch. That label comes with a free execution. Fire or water, dealer's choice. Childbirth, a gamble. There's no prenatal care, no clean tools, no pain relief. Midwives do what they can, but even minor problems can be deadly for mother, child, or both. Some women survive 10 pregnancies, others don't make it past 2. But don't relax yet, because once the baby arrives, your workload only increases. Now, you're nursing a newborn in a hut full of lice, while also expected to cook, clean, care for everyone, and still help in the fields. There's no break. Not today, not tomorrow. You are the break for everyone else. If you're unmarried, you're suspicious. If you're widowed, vulnerable. If you speak your mind, dangerous. Women who didn't conform were often accused of witchcraft, especially if they knew about herbs, had a strong personality, or made eye contact on a rainy Tuesday. Even in the church, your role is limited. Nuns live under strict rules, no speaking without permission, no freedom of movement, and your spiritual value, always ranked below men. In short, if you're a woman in the Middle Ages, your mission is to endure, obey, reproduce, and suffer in silence, preferably while smiling. Because even in a time of universal misery, women were somehow expected to suffer gracefully. So far you've battled filth, famine, injustice, and maybe a goat, and just when you think it can't get worse, here comes violence, loud, bloody, and widely accepted. Let's be honest, the Middle Ages were not peaceful. Law and order mostly meant, hope the local lord isn't in a bad mood. Violence is everywhere, in homes, in streets, on the battlefield, even in disputes at the town bakery. Crime is common, punishment is brutal, and justice? More of a show than a system. Steal a loaf of bread, lose a hand. Caught lying, your tongue might get pierced. Gossip too much, meet the scold's bridle, a metal cage strapped to your head with a bar across your tongue. For correction, of course. Accused of something serious? Heresy, theft, witchcraft. Time to prove your innocence through trial by ordeal. One version. Stick your hand in boiling water to grab a stone. If your hand heals in 3 days, you're innocent. If not, guilty. Another version. Get tossed into a river. Sink, innocent, and probably dead. Float, guilty, and punished anyway. It's like a medieval game show where survival is the prize and the host wants you to lose. And if you're sentenced to die, that's a public event. Executions were entertainment. Hangings, burnings, beheadings. Spectators brought snacks. The medieval version of cable TV. Domestic violence, considered normal. Husbands were allowed, even expected, to discipline their wives and kids. Street fights, commonplace. You could get beaten just for looking sideways at a noble's horse. And war, always brewing. Local feuds, land disputes, crusades. Someone was always marching off to stab someone else for honor, God, or boredom. Violence isn't a breakdown of medieval society. It is society. Everyone lives with the constant knowledge that life is fragile, justice is random, and your neighbor might bash your head in over a pig. So walk carefully, keep your eyes low, and never trust anyone carrying a club. At this point, you've made it through lice, leeches, laundryless suffering, and the looming risk of public disembowelment. But now comes the final chapter of most medieval lives. Death. Not noble, not glorious, not delayed. If you're still breathing after 40, you're basically a celebrity. They might even call you the Old One, which is less a nickname and more a statistical miracle. Let's break it down. The average life expectancy? Around 30 to 40 years. But that number is heavily skewed by infant mortality. Nearly half of all children died before reaching age 5. One infection. One bad winter. That's all it took. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no hope. If you made it through childhood, you entered adulthood already worn down. Work began as soon as you could walk. By 25, your joints crackled like an old chapel door. You might be missing several teeth, a finger, and most of your optimism. Women faced a particularly cruel challenge: childbirth. It was one of the leading causes of death for women. No prenatal care, no sterile tools, no painkillers, just hot water, whispered prayers, and someone holding your hand while you bled out on a pile of straw. For men, the threats were different, but just as relentless. Farming accidents, infections from small cuts, fights with drunk neighbors, a crusade gone sideways. Even walking to the market could get you ambushed by a bored bandit or hassled by an angry tax collector. And then there were the silent killers, plague, turning cities into graveyards overnight. Famine, lasting entire seasons, thinning out whole villages. Or maybe you died from something simpler, like eating spoiled grain and spending your final hours hallucinating and yelling at the walls. As for funerals, you were lucky if you got one. Most bodies were buried quickly to prevent disease. No embalming, no polished coffins, just a shallow hole, a few whispered prayers, and a thin layer of dirt. if there was still space left in the churchyard. So yes, in medieval Europe, life was brutal, short, and constantly under siege by death in all its creative forms. You didn't retire, you just stopped showing up. And speaking of exits, let's wrap up your final chapter. How's your day been? You woke up in filth, relieved yourself into a bucket, brushed your teeth with wishful thinking, skipped breakfast because there wasn't any, worked until your spine filed a complaint, scratched your way through itchy wool, prayed not to catch the plague, and nearly got executed for owning a squirrel. Welcome to a single day in medieval Europe. Still dreaming of becoming a knight? Think again. That shiny, romantic version of the Middle Ages, the noble knights, the ladies in towers, the epic feasts beneath chandeliers of flickering candlelight. It's a myth, a fantasy, polished by fairy tales and heavily sanitized history books. The real medieval world was harsh, unfair, relentless. Hierarchy ruled everything. If you were born poor, you stayed poor. If you were born rich, congrats. You had a better chance of surviving, but you were still one bowl of bad stew away from dysentery and a hasty grave. Even the nobility weren't safe from misery. Castles were drafty stone boxes filled with fleas, smoke, and awkward political marriages. Sure, you had a fur cloak and a goblet of wine, but also a 50% chance of dying in a sword fight or from an infected splinter. Simpler times weren't simple. They were survival on hard mode. Everything took longer, everything hurt more, even basic things like childbirth or chewing. And if you found a quiet moment to dream, there wasn't much to do with it. No mobility, no medicine, no internet to search. What is this weird rash? You lived, you suffered, and you died within a 10-mile radius of where you were born. But here's the wildest part. Through all of it, people still laughed. They sang songs. They fell in love. They told stories by firelight. They made meaning out of misery. Not because life was easy, but because humans are stubborn like that. Even in the darkest chapters, we carve out space for light. So tonight, as you lie in a warm bed, surrounded by walls that don't leak, with plumbing, antibiotics, and a fridge full of snacks, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to the modern world, and to the people who came before you, who fought off rats, famine, and feudalism, so you wouldn't have to. Tonight, let's dim the lights, close the door gently, and let ourselves drift into the darker corners of medieval history. Not the grand battles or royal feasts, but the quiet steps in the shadows, the world of assassins. Not the kind from the movies, no. This isn't a tale of glory or fame. This is the grim, often forgotten story of those who killed in silence and lived in silence too. Before we begin, feel free to press like or subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these quiet journeys into the past. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always comforting to know that someone else is listening, somewhere out there, under the same stars. Now, settle in. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum in the background. Let's begin. No one in the Middle Ages woke up one morning thinking, I'd love to sneak through the dark and stab a noble for a handful of coins. Becoming an assassin was never a dream. It was a consequence. It was the end of the road, when all other paths had crumbled. Most assassins were not monks trained in mountaintop temples. They were broken souls, peasants with nothing left, soldiers with stains on their honor, thieves who knew how to disappear, people so far from society's gaze, they could vanish in a crowd or kill a man and still not be missed in the census. If you had land or a title, you didn't do the killing. You paid for it. But if you were hungry, invisible, and just smart enough to stay out of reach, someone, somewhere, might slide a coin purse across a wooden table and whisper a name, not a pleasant name, not a harmless one. You weren't asked to silence a quiet farmer, no. You were sent after a corrupt baron, a bishop with secrets, someone surrounded by guards, and maybe a moat. The pay? Tempting. The job? Terrifying. By the time someone even considered it, they had nothing left to lose. No home, no family, no future, and certainly no pension plan. And perks? There were none. No evenings off, no retirement, no chance to brag about your work at the tavern. You couldn't hang a sign that said, "Quiet eliminations, inquire within." You just stayed silent, moved quickly, and never told a soul, especially not over ale at the inn. You became a traveling carpet seller, a wandering herbalist, anything but what you truly were, someone who vanished into the night with a name no one wanted to say aloud. Let's clear something up. Medieval assassins weren't trained under candlelight, in sacred monasteries, with gentle flute music and wise mentors. There were no montages, no inspiring speeches, no scrolls of secret knowledge. Most learned the hard way, by failing. If you survived your first few attempts, you were already ahead of the curve. Maybe you had military training. Good. You knew how to grip a blade. But if not, well, stabbing is simple. Escaping afterward, with all your organs intact, that's where the real challenge lay. There were no handbooks, no meetings, no welcome packets. You didn't learn how to spot a body double. You figured it out, while dangling from a windowsill, praying you hadn't crept into the wrong room again. As for poison, that was trial and error, mostly error. Sometimes your mark got dizzy, sometimes he got suspicious, sometimes you drank the wrong cup. There was no medieval poison control, only hope, herbs, and a strong stomach. Now and then, if fate was kind, you might cross paths with a thief, a mercenary, or another assassin, older, tired, willing to show you how to walk without making your boots squeak. But mentors were rare, and they never stayed long. Assassins didn't retire, they vanished. Weapons? You didn't carry a broadsword, too heavy, too loud. You had a dagger, probably stolen, maybe a garrote if you were lucky. Whatever fit under a cloak, without clinking. You weren't a martial arts master. You were someone with calloused hands, quiet steps, and a strange comfort in alleyways. Success didn't come from training. It came from survival. You learned how to kill by doing it quickly, clumsily, and disappearing before anyone could sketch your face and pin it to the church door. There were no graduation ceremonies, no applause, only bruises, bloodstains, and the quiet, creeping realization that you were very much alone. So, why did anyone become an assassin? The answer was coin. Cold, heavy, clinking coin. The promise of it was enough to tempt a desperate soul. But the truth? You got paid. In lies. When someone hires an assassin, they don't want loyalty. They want silence. A one-time job, no witnesses. Preferably, not even you. They promise silver. Half now, half when it's done, if they're feeling generous. But when it's done is just code. It means, after we check that you didn't mess it up, or make us look bad, or leave any trace, or live long enough to tell anyone. So you do the job. You slip through shadows. You kill a baron in his sleep. It's not glorious, not noble, Just done. And when you return? Ah, yes, the payment. Terribly sorry. The client disappeared. Or worse, they try to kill you. Because a knife to the gut is cheaper than a bonus. Even when you did get paid, it was never enough. Not for the risk. Not for the blood. Not for the 3 long days you spent hiding in a haystack with fleas and moral regret. You'd get a handful of coins, a half-hearted nod, and a reminder you were never here. Also, some jobs were traps, political stings. You'd be sent to kill someone dangerous, only to find out it was a decoy, surrounded by guards. Congratulations. You just walked into a setup, and your name was already carved on the gallows. And even if the job was real, you couldn't exactly go to court. Your Honor, I'd like to sue Lord Edmund for breach of assassin contract. Number. The only court you'd see was the one that put the rope around your neck. So you adapted, took what you could, demanded payment up front, and trusted no one. Not even the little scribe who swore this job would change your life. And it did. Mostly by shortening it. Being an assassin meant living on broken promises and disappearing before they broke you. So, you've taken the job. You've been lied to. You might die. Let's talk gear. Forget the stories. There were no retractable wrist blades, no smoke bombs, no magical daggers, no crossbows hidden in your boots. Your tools were whatever you could steal, sharpen, or stash under a tattered cloak without jingling. If you were lucky, and I mean found a gold coin in a corpse's boot lucky, you had a good dagger. Not fancy, not shaped like a serpent, just sharp, hopefully not rusted, and ideally, not still stained from the last man you used it on. Poison? It existed, but forget the elegance. Medieval poisons were messy, unpredictable, made from herbs, minerals, and the occasional toad intestine. Some killed instantly, some took hours, some just made your target vomit for 2 days, and then recover, angrier, and more suspicious of stew. Rope could be useful. You could climb with it, strangle with it, tie things up. But you'd better know your knots. Nothing ruins the moment like muttering, "Wait, does this loop go under?" Bows? Sure, if you had one, if you knew how to use it, and if you could sneak it past palace guards disguised as a florist. But most assassinations were not from afar. They were up close, personal, quick, quiet, and hopefully not too slippery. You didn't get a backup weapon if your blade bent, broke, or fell down a well. Time to improvise. Roof tile, rusty nail, shoe buckle, with ambition. You hid your tools in hems, boots, or inside hollowed-out loaves of bread, and you kept them close. Not for safety, but because in your line of work, your weapon was your best friend, your employer, and your only retirement plan. There were no upgrades, no gear refinements, no second chances, just the shadows and the sound of your own breath, waiting. You didn't polish your gear. You prayed it wouldn't fail you, right in the middle of the act. Because in the end, it wasn't the weapon that did the killing. It was you, alone, poorly equipped, and expected to perform miracles with a spoon and a prayer. Assassins weren't hired to eliminate sleepy candle makers in quiet alleys. No one paid for Jeff, the harmless lantern guy. Your targets were important. Nobles, bishops, military officers, even royalty. And those people, they were not easy to reach. First, the guards, not one or two, dozens, armed, armored, and well-fed. Some guarded the front, some the back, some simply stood there, daring you to blink the wrong way. You'd spend days just studying, learning the patrols, the creaking doors, and exactly how many steps before the knight with asthma needed to pause for breath. Then, there were the walls. Castles didn't have porches. They had gates, murder holes, and moats full of creatures that didn't welcome guests. Even if you avoided drowning, you still had to worry about arrow slits and boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil. Your job description quietly included maybe flambéed for peeking, and don't forget the servants, the scribes, the cooks, the stable boys, all of them with eyes. One odd glance from you, and suddenly the guard captain is on high alert. Assassins didn't just fight blades, they fought gossip. And in the Middle Ages, gossip traveled faster than a plague on horseback if it meant keeping one's head attached. Then, there was your target, paranoid, rightfully so, surrounded by liars, jealous cousins, and advisors with very sharp smiles. They didn't eat without a tester. They didn't sleep without 3 locks on the door. Some even rotated bedrooms at night, like a very deadly version of musical chairs. And if you heard they were attending a feast, don't get excited. Yes, they'd be drunk, but so would you. And you'd still need to get past royal guards, 3 dogs, an alert jester, and 50 witnesses holding tankards. Even getting close could take weeks. You'd pose as a servant, bribe a chambermaid, hide inside a barrel, or pretend to fix tapestries for hours. And when the moment finally arrived, you had only one shot, one perfect moment, silent, precise, clean. Or you'd end up hanging by the castle gate with a wooden sign that read, "Nice try." Now, let's be honest. When you picture a medieval assassin, you probably see sleek black robes, leather bracers, a hood dancing in the moonlight. The truth? You looked like a sick goat herder with something to hide. Disguises weren't glamorous. You didn't have tailored cloaks or sleek armor. You wore what you could find, a beggar's rags, a monk's robe 2 sizes too big, or a guard's tunic that still smelled like fear and onions. The goal was to vanish in the crowd, and that meant blending in with people who hadn't bathed in weeks, limped from old injuries, and twitched from hunger and nerves. You didn't look suspicious because of your cloak. You looked suspicious because you kept adjusting your belt to hide a dagger wrapped in cheesecloth. And forget masks. There were no elegant options. Most face coverings just made you look like a leper, which, yes, kept people at a distance, but also made it very difficult to get into parties. If someone asked who you were, you had to lie. Quickly, convincingly. I'm Brother Tobias, keeper of silent prayer and rooftop maintenance. And even if you got past the guards, noble houses weren't full of fools. Servants noticed new faces, especially ones that held chamber pots the wrong way, or didn't know the cook's cat's name. You were always one awkward pause away from being clubbed with a candlestick, and if your disguise worked, well done. You now had to stay in character for hours, surrounded by temptingly stab-worthy targets, pretending not to notice any of them. Also, wigs didn't exist. If you needed to look older or younger, you smeared dirt on your face, squinted a little, and hoped no one leaned in too close to notice your beard was glued on with honey. Because in truth, your disguise didn't protect you. It just delayed the inevitable. Your disguise bought you maybe 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you needed to vanish, or be very, very convincing, because no one wants to be the assassin caught in the bishop's laundry room, dressed in a nun's habit, holding a sword, especially not on a feast day. In medieval times, if you were an assassin, you didn't have a team, no sidekick with a crossbow. No clever alchemist brewing poisons in a secret underground lair. No handler handing you scrolls with warm encouragement and cryptic instructions. You had you, a rusty dagger, and a deeply unhealthy relationship with trust. There were no guilds, not the kind you could rely on, and whispers of a secret brotherhood of assassins. Mostly just tavern talk, spilled from mouths soaked in mead and boredom. You were more likely to meet a ghost than another professional who actually wanted to chat. Why the isolation? Because the fewer people who knew you existed, the longer you lived. Every contact was a risk. Every conversation, a possible noose. Even your client might not know your real name. And if they did, you were already planning your escape. Companionship? Laughable. Friends asked questions. Lovers noticed bruises and bloodstains, and why you always slept with a blade under your pillow. You couldn't settle. You couldn't slow down. One mistake, one glance in a marketplace, and your life turned into a sprint toward the nearest sewer grate. Even other criminals kept their distance. Thieves, smugglers, they were sociable. You were the one people whispered about, the one who made others disappear. You weren't feared, you were avoided, not because you were powerful, but because you were dangerous, and worse, a liability. No one wanted to share stew with someone whose job could bring a mob with torches. And don't expect sympathy. You couldn't sit at the inn and confess how hard it was to sleep after quietly strangling a corrupt bishop. If you talked about your work, people assumed you were either insane or a threat. They were usually right. So, you kept your secrets, your scars, your weapons, to yourself. At inns, you sat in the darkest corner, back to the wall, eyes on the door. You never drank too much. You never stayed too long. You didn't give your name unless someone paid for it first. And even then, it wasn't your real one. Being an assassin meant learning to disappear, not just into the shadows, but from entire lives you never got to live. Let's say you took the job. You planned everything, bribed the right doorman, disguised yourself as a chimney sweep with impressive soot credentials. And then, you froze. Maybe the target turned too soon. Maybe they were with their child. Maybe your hand trembled at the worst possible moment, like a terrified squirrel holding a knife. Guess what? You're dead. Because failure wasn't a slap on the wrist or a poor performance review. Failure was public, painful, and theatrical. Ropes, fire, wheels, iron devices with names like the Bone Cracker's Delight. Missing the kill meant the operation collapsed. The target survived and told everyone what nearly happened. Suddenly, you weren't a shadow anymore. You were a wanted man. Posters nailed to every tavern wall within 30 miles, crude sketches, clear enough to ruin your life. And those guards you once slipped past, now, they're motivated. But sometimes, it wasn't the guards or the target you had to fear. It was your client. If you failed, you weren't just useless. You were dangerous. Someone who could be caught, tortured, and forced to speak. And the very people who once paid you would now be the first to pay someone else to silence you. There were no second chances, no do-overs, no friendly notes that read, "Oops, I'll try again tomorrow." You had one moment, one strike, and if you missed, the best you could hope for was to die quickly before anyone found out who sent you. Failure also brought shame, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that crawled into your chest at night and whispered, "You didn't just fail to kill, you failed to disappear." To be perfect, that was the goal, because for an assassin, perfection wasn't pride, It was survival. Anything less, and you might as well. Paint a target on your back and start rehearsing your last words. It didn't matter how many jobs you'd done. 12 successful kills. No one cared, because in this line of work, you were only as good as your last one. And if that last one didn't happen, you ran. So, you did it. The plan worked. The dagger struck true. No scream, no guard, just a quiet thud. And a very important person who no longer was. Congratulations. Now run for your life. Being a successful assassin in the Middle Ages didn't mean lounging on a rooftop with wine in hand and flames behind you. It meant stumbling through a back alley, boots soaked in blood, with a dog already sniffing your scent. Somewhere in the distance, there was no celebration, no drink with colleagues, no good job from your client. You didn't even get to admire your work. The moment the blade landed, your job changed. Now, you had to escape. Fast. Guards would be coming, doors locked, horses tied up on the wrong side of town. You, probably bleeding. Your exit plan had to be prepared. Before the strike, escape routes, disguises, fallback hiding spots. Maybe a boatman who owed you a favor, or at least didn't ask questions, because the city would lock down within minutes. Gates shut, checkpoints armed, and a dozen angry men swinging swords while holding a sketch of your face and the phrase, "Maybe armed and extremely stabby." And your client? Even if they planned to pay you, they weren't meeting you with a smile and a thank you note. They vanished, because an assassin who finishes the job is now the most dangerous person alive. You knew too much. You'd proven you could get into places. Others couldn't. So even when you succeeded, you walked away, with coins in your hand and a new, much larger target on your back. And what did you earn? A week of sleeping in haylofts, bribing ferrymen, shaving in the dark, and pretending to be Brother Lucian as you traveled with monks, heading east. Because success didn't mean safety. It meant starting over, in a new city, under a new name, with even more people, hunting you, this time. So yes, you made the kill. Now run, fast, far, without looking back. If being a medieval assassin wasn't miserable enough, poor, hunted, sleeping in places that smelled like goat, you also had to deal with everyone else's imagination. Because in the Middle Ages, assassins weren't just feared, they were believed to be cursed. To the average villager, you weren't a man with a knife. You were something unholy, a shadow who whispered to demons, who smeared frog guts on his blade. Under a full moon, why else? Could you sneak past guards and vanish into thin air? Logic wasn't terribly fashionable back then, but superstition, that was everywhere. Some believed you could shapeshift. Others whispered you were invisible unless bathed in holy water. One tale claimed assassins had pacts with forest spirits and could breathe death through stone walls, walk through a village, and you might hear someone murmur, "Don't look at him, he might hex the baby." Even your tools, raised eyebrows, a dagger clearly forged in a cursed forge. Poison, that wasn't chemistry, it was witchcraft, and you probably stirred it. With a severed toe, under a blood moon, you'd think that kind of fear might help you, but it didn't. Superstitious mobs, don't ask questions, They just throw stones, light fires, and shout things like, "Burn him before he calls lightning." Your reputation made people panic. If someone died, a fever, an accident, a chicken bone in the throat, someone would whisper, maybe it was the Shadow Man. Maybe it was him. You could be hunted, just for being nearby, when something strange happened, which meant you never stayed anywhere for long, remained too long, and suddenly, a priest is ringing bells and 5 angry farmers are holding pitchforks, like they've been practicing for this day, and heaven help you if they caught you with anything unusual, dried herbs, suspicious, odd coins, witchcraft, a strange accent, definitely demonic. That was enough for someone to shout, "Sorcerer," and light a torch. In a world where monsters wore human faces, being quiet, clever, or fast made you a target. And in medieval logic, targets needed to die, quickly, and preferably on fire. Ah, poison. The assassin's elegant touch. A quiet kill, no screaming, no blood, just a sip, a stagger, a sigh, and silence. That's the theory anyway. In practice, poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was like trying to win a bar fight with herbal tea and a passive-aggressive letter. Poisons were unreliable. You didn't have neat little pills or bottles labeled instant doom. You had plants, mushrooms, minerals, and the occasional toad. You had to gather, grind, and pray. Even then, your poison might only give your target a stomachache and a renewed commitment to hiring more guards. There were no precise measurements, no neat vials, no instructions. You eyeballed everything, a pinch too little, and the noble just vomits and cancels dinner. A pinch too much, and you die before the first course is even served. And the kitchens? They were chaos. You couldn't simply wander in and season the stew with nightshade. You had to bribe someone, or impersonate a cook, or sneak in while the others were distracted. And sometimes you had to try and poison a meal that passed through 3 food tasters and a dog. Yes, a dog. Because if your victim was a noble, dinner wasn't a meal. It was a security protocol. The food was tasted, blessed, sniffed by the steward, the priest, and even the jester. By the time the plate reached their hands, it had gone through more security than the king's wedding. And let's say, somehow, you did it. You slipped the poison in. No one noticed. The target ate it. Even then, the outcome was unpredictable. Some poisons worked in minutes. Others took days. One moment they were laughing, the next clutching their stomach and demanding to see their astrologer. And if they survived, they didn't blame the cook or the food tester. They blamed you, the quiet one with the herbal knowledge and the twitchy eyes. So no, poison wasn't elegant. It was slow, messy, unreliable. And if you were caught, you didn't die quietly. You were interrogated, painfully, until you confessed to poisoning everyone, from the duke to the dog. And what if you succeeded? Let's say you removed a tyrant, sabotaged a royal bloodline, silenced a dangerous enemy. Surely, someone would remember your name. You were an assassin, and your name was never meant to be remembered. At best, you were a rumor, a shadow in a hood, a foreigner with cold eyes, a man who never finished his ale. You could pull off the most legendary kill of the century and still appear in the official record as a mysterious death, because that was the point. Your client didn't want a story. They wanted silence, plausible deniability. The less they knew your name, the safer they were, and the less chance you'd be around to use poison on them. So the moment the job was done, your name disappeared. If you even used a real one. You didn't sign your work. You didn't keep trophies. You didn't brag. You didn't exist. Outside the moment of the kill, and if someone did know your name, they were a loose end, and loose ends had very short lives. Forget about honor. There were no medals for silence, no stone monuments for the man who stopped a war with one dagger in the night. If a noble wanted a statue, they commissioned it for themselves. You got a wooden box, an unmarked grave, or, if things went truly badly, your head on a spike, labeled traitor. Sometimes your name was only known, so it could be cursed. You became a warning, a whisper. Don't cross the king. Remember what happened to Lord Ulrich? Yes. And the man who did it? Gone. Like a ghost. That was your legacy. Not fame, not glory, not even fear. Just absence. You weren't supposed to leave a mark. You were supposed to vanish. And if you stayed long enough to be remembered, that was your final mistake. Because in the medieval world, heroes were remembered. Assassins were erased. So, you survived. The job was done. You even got paid. A miracle. Now all you had to do was lay low, keep your head down, and trust that your client would honor the deal, protect your identity. Right? Wrong. Because in the world of medieval assassins, there was one rule, more sacred than don't get caught. Never trust anyone, especially not the one paying you. Your client, be they noble, merchant, or a bishop with ambition and a very loose sense of morality, didn't hire you out of respect. They hired you because they needed something dark, something shameful, and you were the sharpest blade in the shadows. But once the job was complete, you became something else. A liability. You knew too much. Who wanted who dead, when, why, and how much they were willing to pay for it. That made you dangerous, not just to their enemies, but to them. So what did they do? They vanished, denied they ever met you, or worse, they sent someone else to clean up, to tie up loose ends with something much sharper than ink. Some even double-booked. One assassin to complete the job, and another to kill the first one. No refunds, just reduced risk. And if you ever tried to blackmail a client, tried to use what you knew as leverage, that was your final mistake. Because powerful people in the Middle Ages, they didn't negotiate with assassins. They eliminated them. If your client had a shred of honor, a rare and dying species, you might get paid and left alone. But even then, you had to assume someone was watching. Somewhere. Someone was already memorizing your walk, sharpening steel just in case. You were a secret that couldn't speak, a shadow that couldn't linger. Even success wasn't enough to earn trust, because if you'd killed once, you could kill again. And no one, not even the person who hired you, wanted to be next. Now, let's imagine you beat the odds. You survived the betrayals, the poisonings, the double crosses. the contracts. You even outlived your clients, your enemies, and maybe your own conscience. So, do you retire? Absolutely not. In the Middle Ages, assassins didn't retire. They disappeared, or they died. Sometimes, both. There were no banquets, no quiet cottages by the sea, no pensions and gold coins, just silence and shadows. Even if you walked away from the job, your past didn't. You carried too many secrets, too many names, too much blood. People didn't want you resting. They wanted you forgotten, which often meant buried. And even if no one came after you, big if, you still lived in fear that one day someone would. A young assassin, eager to make a name for himself, just handed a contract for a figure in the dark who used to be someone dangerous. So, you changed your name. Again, you moved to a quiet village where no one asked too many questions. You faked a limp, sold herbs, told people you'd once been a guard, but you never slept well. You avoided crowds, always sat facing the door. You kept your dagger under the floorboard, next to a pouch of coins you never touched, because it still smelled like the man you took it from. And you didn't trust yourself either. Years of silent kills and quiet escapes had twisted your mind. Every knock at the door made your heart race. Every stranger on the road might know who you were. You stopped dreaming because dreams were dangerous. You couldn't love, couldn't relax, couldn't laugh too loudly. You lived like a ghost pretending to be a man. Because the truth, there was no end game for a medieval assassin. Just a slow, cold fade into obscurity, always moving, always watching, until one day you slipped into the dark and no one noticed. And maybe that was the best you could hope for. By now, you've probably realized it. Being a medieval assassin wasn't darkly romantic. It wasn't noble, and it wasn't even all that profitable. It was a grim, thankless, short-lived path, wrapped in blood-stained linen, and followed by a trail of people who wanted you dead. You wouldn't last, not a week, maybe not even a day, because you'd start with the wrong assumptions, that you'd be sleek, in control, a whisper in the dark. But what you'd really be is cold, hungry, and one bad guess, from the noose. You'd slip into town, cloak pulled tight, ready for action, only to discover your target had already moved. The guards, they're drunk, but they're still quick to draw steel, and the stable boy you paid for information, he just sold you out for a mug of ale and half a loaf of bread. You freeze at the wrong time, stab the wrong man, get spotted by a maid who once saw your face outside the chapel, and suddenly, you're no longer a shadow, you're the problem. So, you run. But you're not used to medieval streets, the mud, the loose stones, and the absurd number of chickens just wandering everywhere. You slip, you fall, and you're tackled by a guard named Thomas, recently dumped and desperate for someone to blame. Let's say you survive that. Now you face the aftermath. No allies, no honor, no future, just suspicion, whispers, and the quiet realization that even if you succeeded, the best you could hope for was to die old and alone, behind a false name, in a village that still believes in fairies. So no, you wouldn't last. And honestly, you shouldn't even try. Because the assassin's life wasn't cool. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't cinematic. It was a cruel machine that chewed people up and spat out nothing but silence. It offered power, but no peace. Purpose, but no place. You didn't make history. You erased yourself from it. And at the end, there was no applause, no recognition, just a silence. No one would question, because no one even remembered you were there. Now, let's step away from the shadows. to another kind of danger, one not cloaked in hoods or daggers, but wrapped in prophecy and the bloodline of kings. Before she was the feared queen of Macedonia, Olympias was known as Myrtale, a Molossian princess from the wild tribal lands of Epirus. Her people claimed descent from Achilles himself, and whether or not the blood of heroes truly flowed in her veins, one thing is certain: she was not born to stand at the edges of history. From a young age, Myrtle was steeped in ritual, in mystery, in whispers of the divine. Her world was shaped not just by politics, but by prophecy, by ecstatic rites, by reverence for the old gods. She wasn't the kind of princess who smiled politely and embroidered roses into silk. She was drawn to serpents, omens, and the wild dances of Dionysian cults, where barefoot women twirled beneath the moon, calling to the divine with wine on their lips and trance in their eyes. Her connection to the gods wasn't performance, it was personal. She didn't just worship, she embodied. According to ancient sources, written no doubt by men both terrified and enthralled, she kept sacred snakes in her chambers, and some claimed they even shared her bed. Literal? Perhaps. Or just the kind of myth powerful women attract. Either way, the legend stuck. To her allies, it made her divine. To her enemies, it made her dangerous. But her power didn't begin in a palace. It began in the flicker of torchlight, among whispers and coils of sacred serpents. She wasn't just a princess. She was an oracle, a living symbol of something older than kings and colder than steel. So when Philip II of Macedon, brilliant, brutal, and famously unfaithful, arrived at the island of Samothrace for a sacred ritual, he didn't just meet a beautiful young woman, he met a mystery, and he couldn't resist. Their union wasn't just political, it was a collision of power and prophecy. Some said lightning split the sky on their wedding night. Others whispered that Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb. All of it became legend. But one thing is clear: their union didn't just produce a child, it produced Alexander the Great, and from the very first breath, Olympias intended to shape his destiny. Her marriage to Philip was no fairy tale. It was a storm, a clash of pride, prophecy, and paranoia. Philip, always chasing power, took wives like trophies. But Olympias was no ornament. She had her own court, her own alliances, her own gods, and she listened not to courtiers, but to oracles. And then came the child, Alexander. Even his birth was touched by myth. Some said Olympias dreamed of fire dancing around her son without burning him. Others said Philip saw a vision, a lion, sealing his wife's womb. Real or not, they acted like their son was born to rule the world. But even as the child rose, the marriage began to fall apart. Olympias resented Philip's other wives, especially one, a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice. Philip married her late in life, and this was no simple domestic tension. It was a threat. Cleopatra had the one thing Olympias never could: a pure Macedonian lineage. Any son she bore would be seen, by nobles and generals alike, as more legitimate, more worthy, a rival to Alexander. Olympias saw it clearly. The palace wasn't a home anymore. It was a battlefield, and she would use every snake, every dream, every whisper of prophecy to make sure her son wasn't just remembered, but crowned. She was no longer Myrtle. She was Olympias now, and no one would take her son's throne without facing her wrath. By the time Alexander reached his teens, the palace at Pella was a nest of rivalry, veiled insults, cold silences, strategic smiles. Olympias wasn't just fighting for influence, she was fighting for survival. She knew the palace was crawling with snakes, but it was she who had taught them how to bite. Philip II began to distance himself. He campaigned more, drank more, and worst of all, listened more to his Macedonian advisors. Then came the final blow. Philip married Cleopatra Eurydice, not the Egyptian queen of legend, but a Macedonian girl from a powerful family. Her uncle, Attalus, was one of Philip's top generals. To Olympias, this wasn't just betrayal, it was war. At the wedding feast, Attalus, drunk on wine and pride, mocked Olympias and Alexander, questioned the boy's legitimacy. Was he truly Philip's son? Or was he, as his mother often claimed, the child of a god? It was meant as an insult, but Olympias seized the myth. Let them whisper, let them wonder, let them believe her son was touched by Zeus. It made him untouchable. Alexander stormed out. Olympias left Macedon entirely, but her exile was not surrender. It was strategy. In Epirus, she was still royal. She could gather allies, send messages, and quietly watch as Philip's palace began to rot from within. She didn't need to be there to be dangerous. Then came the shockwave. Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, on the very eve of his campaign into Persia. He was poised to become not just king, but emperor. And now, he was gone. The question whispered through every marble hall. Who did it? Was it Pausanias, the slighted bodyguard? Was it court intrigue, Alexander? Or was it Olympias? No one could prove it. No one dared, but many believed it. And then, within days, Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn child were dead. Some said Olympias returned to the palace like a storm, and the first thing she did was eliminate the rival queen. Not quietly, not discreetly, but publicly, symbolically, cruelly. Some accounts claim Cleopatra was forced to hang herself after watching her infant child killed before her eyes. Others say Olympias had the child thrown onto a funeral pyre. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: no mercy was shown. Olympias understood what many queens didn't. In a royal court, mercy is a liability. A rival child is a future war, and she was done playing defense. With Cleopatra and her bloodline erased, she turned her attention to the throne. Alexander, bold, brilliant, trained by Aristotle himself, was declared king. And yes, he had charisma. Yes, he was the son of Philip. But don't be fooled. It wasn't charm that secured his crown. It was Olympias. She knew which generals to threaten, which nobles to flatter, which enemies to remove quietly. She wasn't just defending her son's rise, she was building it, brick by whispered brick, and Alexander didn't always approve. Alexander reportedly disapproved of the violence against Cleopatra's family, but he didn't stop it, because deep down, he understood what Olympias had always known. Power demands blood, and in Macedon, bloodlines were both blessing and curse. With her son now king, Olympias began to recede from public life. But this was no retirement. She simply shifted her tactics, from public strikes to whispered influence. As Alexander prepared to launch his campaign into Persia, she remained in Macedon, not as a passive queen mother, but as a guardian of destiny. She sent him sacred relics, consulted oracles, performed rituals on his behalf. To Olympias, Alexander's mission was not military. It was divine. He wasn't going to war. He was fulfilling prophecy. And as long as she breathed, no rival, Macedonian, Persian, or otherwise, would derail that plan. She had crowned him. She had cleansed the palace. Now, she would guard his empire. From behind the curtain, with teeth bared. While Alexander marched east, Olympias remained in Macedon, a queen without a throne, but not without power. Her official title was Queen Mother, but in truth, she ruled in all but name. Regency was handed to Antipater, one of Alexander's trusted generals, but Olympias refused to be sidelined. She wrote to her son constantly, not sweet letters, not maternal comfort. These were political briefings, laced with omens and venom. And Alexander, thousands of miles away, read every word. She warned him of false friends, questioned his advisors, criticized his fascination with Persian customs, his foreign wives, his temptation to call himself a god. No one else dared speak to him like that. But Olympias was not like anyone else. She spoke as a mother, as a priestess, as someone sent by the divine. Meanwhile, back in Macedon, Antipater grew resentful. Olympias undermined him at every turn. She used her religious status, her family name, and her far-reaching influence to stir opposition. She had allies in Epirus, in Thessaly, and among the aristocracy. And with Olympias, a whisper could be deadlier than a sword. Her letters to Alexander grew more urgent. She painted Antipater as another Philip, ambitious, calculating, ready to betray. Whether she believed it or feared losing control, she kept pressing Alexander to act. But he hesitated. He needed Antipater to hold Greece together while he fought in Asia. And so, the rift widened. Olympias waited. But beneath her robes and divine rituals, patience was wearing thin. She hadn't survived the court of Philip to be ruled by an aging general. As Alexander's empire stretched from the Aegean to India, she began to see the cracks. He was trusting too many foreigners, listening to the wrong voices, forgetting where he came from, forgetting her. Olympias believed his victories came from divine favor and from her, and if he forgot that, she knew how to remind a king who he really was, even if that king was her own son. Then came the dagger. News of Alexander's death in Babylon, 323 BCE. It didn't arrive with horns and banners. It arrived like a blade between the ribs. For Olympias, it wasn't just the loss of her son. It was the collapse of a world she had spent decades building. Her boy, the storm she had summoned, raised, and released, was gone. And he left behind no clear heir, no plan, no peace. His so-called successors, generals and warlords, were already dividing his empire like vultures over a corpse. Antipater still held power in Macedon and Greece, and he had no love for Olympias. Worse still, her daughter, Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was being courted by rival generals, each one hoping to use her blood as a claim to the throne. Olympias saw it clearly. Civil war was not coming. It was already here, and once again, she would act. But this time, she had no Alexander. What she did have was his bloodline, his son, a child, Alexander IV, born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess Alexander had married. Roxana, still in Macedon, was vulnerable. The boy was even more vulnerable than his mother. Olympias saw it clearly. The infant son of Alexander was the last flicker of her son's divine legacy, and that made him two things: a target and a weapon. She allied herself with Roxana, the Bactrian princess, Alexander's widow, and with the child, not just to protect them, but to wield their bloodline on the battlefield of politics. But the tide was shifting. The generals who had once bowed to Alexander had no intention of kneeling to his widow or his mother. They had armies now, ambitions, grudges. Olympias didn't flinch. She'd faced traitors, snakes, kings. A few warlords with borrowed crowns didn't scare her. So, she plotted. She watched. And when Antipater died, his son rose to take his place. Cassander, a man of cold eyes and colder intentions. He had no patience for the old queen's games. It was only a matter of time before they collided. The serpent mother of Alexander and the calculating heir of her bitterest enemy. Alexander was gone, but his shadow was still moving, and Olympias was still coiled within it, ready to strike. Years after her son's death, as the empire crumbled into civil war, Olympias made her boldest move yet. She returned to Macedon, not as a mourning mother, but as a force, furious, focused, and divine. Cassander had seized power. Roxana and young Alexander IV were prisoners, trapped in their own kingdom. Olympias saw what was coming. If she didn't act now, her grandson would vanish, quietly, permanently. So, she struck a deal with Polyperchon, an aging general who still held a sliver of legitimacy. She would return, not to beg, but to rule. And when she crossed back into Macedon, with an army at her back, the ground trembled. Towns opened their gates, soldiers defected, even her enemies paused. Olympias, older, grayer, but still blazing with purpose, was a name that still made the earth shift. And then came her vengeance. One by one, she hunted Cassander's loyalists. She found Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, installed as a puppet king, and had him executed. His wife, Eurydice, was given a choice: end her own life, or have it taken from her. She refused. So Olympias had her strangled. Brutality, wrapped in ceremony, justice, veiled in ritual. Olympias didn't just remove threats, she delivered messages. Only Alexander's blood had the right to rule. All others were pretenders. And for a brief, blazing moment, she held Macedon in her grip. She had restored the dynasty, avenged the betrayals, reminded the world what power looked like when wielded by a woman with nothing left to lose. But power in Macedon was like fire on dry grass, and Cassander was still out there. He returned with cold vengeance. His army was larger, his gold ran deeper, his cruelty sharper. Allies of Olympias began to fade away. Polyperchon lost influence. The tide turned. Olympias, now trapped in the coastal fortress of Pydna, watched her enemies gather. She had lit the match. Now Macedon burned, and the smoke rose to meet her, alone, cut off, surrounded by Cassander's army. The son of her greatest rival had come to finish what his father had started. But Olympias didn't beg. She didn't plead. For nearly a year, she endured the siege, silent, unbending, a statue carved from divine wrath. Food dwindled, disease crept in, hope vanished, and still, she held her ground. Within those crumbling walls, she remained the same woman who had once shaken kings and bent oracles to her will. Even now, she carried herself not as a prisoner, but as the mother of a god. Cassander hesitated. He knew killing her would be dangerous, because even broken, even besieged, Olympias wore myth-like armor. She was still the mother of Alexander the Great. To strike her down might have seemed like blasphemy, so Cassander offered her safety. Surrender, he said, and her life would be spared. But Olympias knew better. She had seen too many royal promises turn to ash. Still, hunger was no longer a discomfort. It was death. Her garrison broke. Her loyalists surrendered. And Olympias, unbending until the very end, was finally handed over. Cassander didn't kill her himself. That would have been too simple, too clean. Instead, He gave her to the families of those she had executed during her brief return to power. "Let them decide," he said, and they did. They condemned her to death. But here's the strange part. When the executioners came, none of them could lift the sword. She stood, frail, silent, her eyes like smoke, watching them. These were Macedonians. They had grown up with her legends, her rituals, her snakes. They had once cheered her son as a living god. And now, there she was, a ghost in flesh, and not one had the courage to strike. So Cassander sent outsiders, foreigners, men with no memory of her power, no stories in their blood, just orders to follow. And thus, Olympias was finally struck down, not with ceremony, not with dignity, but with silence. Her death marked the end of Alexander's bloodline in any meaningful power, and with it, the last ember of a world founded on divine ambition was snuffed out. But even in death, she left behind a shadow, and history has never forgotten the Serpent Queen. Olympias died not on a throne, but in the dust, unarmed, abandoned, executed by the very people she once ruled. But history is strange. It doesn't always favor those who die in silk sheets. Sometimes, it remembers those who went down hissing. Olympias was never meant for quiet history. In life, she wielded motherhood like a sword, prophecy like a shield. She wasn't just the mother of Alexander the Great, she was the architect of his rise. Without her, there is no divine myth, no thunderbolt in the womb, no lion at the gate, no teenage king with the path cleared by whispered rituals and blood-soaked strategy. Olympias didn't just give birth to an empire, she defended it with claws, and even among the ruthless dynasts of the ancient world, she stands apart. She didn't command armies like Cleopatra. She didn't ride into battle like Boudica. Her battlefield was quieter, colder, a world of poisoned goblets, political marriages, oracles, and smoke. She understood the power of fear, and even more, the power of belief. She made people believe her son was divine, and perhaps she believed it herself. Her enemies called her a murderer, a witch, a manipulator, and they weren't wrong. She was all those things, and more. She was forged by a brutal world that valued cunning over kindness. She learned early, mercy was a luxury queens couldn't afford. In the centuries that followed, she was both vilified and mythologized. Some called her a villain, others a visionary. But no historian could ever call her irrelevant. She haunted the legacy of Alexander like a phantom, always behind the curtain. And maybe that's where she belonged. Not as a tragic mother, not as a footnote, but as her own story. A woman wrapped in prophecy, sleeping beside serpents, outliving gods. Her bones turned to dust long ago, but her legend endures. In every tale of ruthless queens, in every whisper of blood-born destiny, in every empire built on myth, she is still there, coiled in the dark, waiting